Hello, this is Rick, your host for today, and welcome to another episode of Gaby's Cheating Stories. Please let us know in the comments from what country do you watch us, and subscribe if you like our stories. It just takes 1 second. Thank you. Now, let's start. You know that kinky phrase that goes, once you go black, you never go back. Well, this story can resume it in many ways. Monique's story began in the shadows of a broken system, where the echoes of her parents' absence reverberated through every corner of her young life. She was just a toddler when they vanished, leaving her to the mercy of a world that didn't seem to care. By the age of 5, she was already a ward of the state, a tiny figure lost in a labyrinth of foster homes and social workers. Each new family promised a fresh start, but none could crack the hardened shell she had built around herself. Monique wasn't just a girl who needed love. She was a girl who had learned to survive without it. Her silence was often mistaken for defiance, her guardedness for ingratitude. By the time she turned 10, Monique had stopped hoping for a family. The orphanage became her reluctant sanctuary, a place where she learned to navigate the cold, unfeeling world on her own. The nights were the hardest, when the weight of her loneliness pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She would stare at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down her face, wondering why no one had ever chosen her. The orphanage in New Jersey was a bleak, gray building that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Monique kept to herself, her sharp tongue and piercing gaze keeping others at bay. She wasn't interested in making friends or playing games. Her world was small, confined to the corners of her mind where she dreamed of a life beyond the orphanage walls. The staff tried to reach her, but Monique had built her walls high and strong. She didn't trust easily, and why should she? Every adult in her life had either abandoned her or failed her. By the time she was a teenager, Monique had become a master at hiding her pain. But beneath her tough exterior, there was a longing for something more, something she couldn't quite name. She would often sit by the window, watching the other kids play, her heart aching with a mix of envy and resentment. She wanted to belong, but she didn't know how. The walls she had built to protect herself had become her prison. As Monique grew older, her rebellious streak became more pronounced. She skipped school, got into fights, and challenged every authority figure who crossed her path. The orphanage staff labeled her as troubled, and potential adoptive families steered clear. Monique didn't care. She had stopped believing in fairy tales a long time ago. But deep down, there was a part of her that still ached for connection. That part of her was buried so deep, though, that even she had trouble finding it. By the time she turned 16, Monique had resigned herself to a life of solitude. She had no family, no friends, and no hope for the future. But fate had other plans for her. One day, as she sat alone in the cafeteria, she overheard a conversation between 2 staff members. They were discussing her future, and the words, aging out, and nowhere to go sent a chill down her spine. For the first time in years, Monique felt a spark of fear. She realized that if she didn't change something, she would be truly alone in the world. It was a warm summer day when Monique first noticed Zach. He was older, in his early 20s, and worked as a groundskeeper at the orphanage. There was something about the way he carried himself, calm, steady, and unbothered by the chaos around him. Monique found herself drawn to him, though she would never admit it. They exchanged glances at first, then a few words here and there. Zach was different from the others. He didn't try to fix her or tell her how to live her life. He simply listened. Over time, their conversations grew longer, and Monique began to let her guard down. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Zach would often find her sitting alone in the garden, and he would sit beside her, offering a quiet companionship that she had never known. He told her stories about his life, his dreams, and his struggles. Monique found herself opening up to him in ways she never thought possible. She told him about her parents, her failed adoptions, and her fears for the future. Zach listened without judgment, his presence a balm to her wounded soul.
Thank you for watching Gaby's cheating stories. Please subscribe. It just take 1 second. Thank you.
When Monique discovered she was pregnant, she was terrified but also hopeful. She thought Zach would stand by her, that they could build a life together. But when she told him the news, his face went pale. He promised come back to figure things out, but he never did. Days turned into weeks, and Zach was nowhere to be found. Monique felt the familiar sting of abandonment, but this time it was worse. She wasn't just responsible for herself anymore. She had a child to think about. With a heavy heart, she made a decision. She couldn't stay in the orphanage, waiting for a man who might never return. She had to leave. The night she left, the air was thick with tension. She packed her few belongings and slipped out of the orphanage, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. As she walked away from the only home she had ever known, she felt a mix of fear and determination. She would make it on her own for her child's sake. The night Monique left the orphanage, the air was thick with tension. She moved quietly, her heart pounding in her chest as she stuffed her few belongings into a worn-out backpack. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, but she knew she couldn't stay. The orphanage, with its cold walls and hollow promises, was no place to raise a child. She glanced back one last time at the building that had been her reluctant sanctuary for so many years. It wasn't home. It never had been, but it was all she had ever known. Now, she was stepping into the unknown with nothing but her determination and the life growing inside her. The bus ride to New York City felt like an eternity. Monique sat by the window, her hands resting protectively on her stomach. She stared out the passing landscape, her mind racing with a mix of fear and hope. What would she do when she got there? Where would she go? She had no money, no connections, and no plan. All she had was a faint belief that the city, with its endless possibilities, might offer her a fresh start. As the bus rumbled on, Monique whispered to her unborn child, promising them both that she would find a way to make it work. When she arrived in New York, the city hit her like a tidal wave. The noise, the crowds, the towering buildings. It was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. Monique felt small, insignificant even, but for the first time in her life, she also felt free. She wandered the streets for hours, her backpack slung over her shoulder, searching for a place to rest. She found a cheap motel in a rough part of town and paid for a night with the little cash she had. The room was dingy and smelled of mildew, but it was a roof over her head. As she lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, Monique made a silent vow. She would not let the city break her. The next morning, she set out to find work. She walked into every store, restaurant, and cafe she passed, asking if they were hiring. Most turned her away, but a small pizzeria in Brooklyn gave her a chance. The owner, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Tony, took one look at her and saw something in her eyes, a fire, a determination. He offered her a job washing dishes and cleaning tables. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Monique threw herself into work, scrubbing pots and mopping floors with a fierce determination. She worked long hours, her hands raw and her feet aching, but she didn't complain. Every dollar she earned was a step closer to a better life. The days blurred together as Monique settled into her new routine. She would wake up early, eat a small breakfast of toast and tea, and head to the pizzeria. After her shift, she would wander the city, exploring its streets and neighborhoods. She loved the energy of New York, the way it buzzed with life and possibility. But it was also a harsh place, especially for someone with so little. Monique learned to navigate his challenges with a mix of grit and resourcefulness. She found a women's shelter where she could sleep safely at night, and she saved every penny she could, dreaming of the day she could afford her own apartment. Despite the hardships, Monique began to feel a sense of pride in what she was accomplishing. She was building a life for herself and her child, one step at a time. The work was hard, and the days were long, but she was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was a fighter, a survivor, and as her belly grew, so did her determination. She would often sit by the East River after her shifts, watching the water ripple under the city lights. She would place her hands on her stomach and whisper to her baby, telling them about the life they would have together. It wouldn't be easy, but would be theirs. One evening, as she walked home from work, Monique passed a small park. She noticed a group of mothers pushing strollers and laughing together. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have that kind of community, that kind of support. But then she shook her head, pushing the thought away. She didn't need anyone else. She had herself, and that was enough. As she continued walking, she felt a kick from inside her belly. She stopped, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. A small smile spread across her face. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her child, and together they would face whatever came their way. Monique's life in New York was far from perfect, but it was hers. She had escaped the orphanage, the pain of Zach's abandonment, and the weight of her past. She was building something new, something real, and as she lay in her small cot at the shelter that night, listening to the sound of the city outside, she felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she believed it could be better. She would make it better, for herself and for her child. It was at the pizzeria that Monique met Damon. He was 22, with a warm smile and a laugh that could light up a room. Damon was different from anyone she had ever known. He was kind, patient, and genuinely interested in her story. Monique found herself opening up to him in ways she never thought possible. Damon didn't judge her for her past or her struggles. He saw her for who she was, a strong, resilient woman who had been through more than most people could imagine. Slowly but surely, Monique began to let him into her life. They would talk for hours after her shifts, sharing their dreams and fears. Damon became her rock, the one person she could rely on. For the first time in her life, Monique felt a glimmer of hope. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have the life she had always dreamed of. Monique's life had finally begun to stabilize. She had a routine, a job, and a growing sense of independence. Damon had become a constant in her life, his presence a soothing balm to the wounds of her past. They spent their days working at the pizzeria and their nights talking about their dreams. Damon wanted to travel the world, to see places he had only read about in books. Monique, on the other hand, dreamed of a quiet life, a home where she could raise her child in peace. Despite their differences, they complemented each other perfectly. Damon's optimism balanced Monique's pragmatism, and together they felt invincible. But just as Monique was starting to believe in the possibility of a happy ending, the past came crashing back into her life. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Zach walked into the pizzeria. Monique was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, when she heard the bell above the door jingle. She looked up and her heart stopped. There he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Monique's hands trembled as she gripped the counter, her mind racing with a flood of emotions, anger, fear, and a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. "Monique," Zach said, his voice soft but firm. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "I've been looking for you." Monique's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to tell him to leave and never come back. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood frozen, her mind replaying the last time she had seen him. The way he had promised to come back. The way he had disappeared without a word. She had spent months trying to forget him, to move on, and now here he was, standing in front of her as if nothing had happened. Damon, who had been in the back kitchen, emerged with a tray of freshly baked bread. He stopped short when he saw Zach, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. Monique finally found her voice. "This is Zach," she said, her tone flat. "He's the father of my child." Damon's expression darkened, but he remained composed. He set the tray down on the counter and stepped closer to Monique, his presence a silent show of support. Zach's eyes flicked between them, and Monique could see the realization dawning on his face. He had expected to find her alone, struggling, maybe even desperate. Instead, he found her strong, independent, and with someone else by her side. "I came to see my son," Zach said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I want to be a part of his life." Monique's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You had your chance," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You left us. You don't get to just show up and act like nothing happened." Zach took another step closer, his eyes pleading. "I made a mistake, Monique. I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right." Monique shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's too late for that," she said, her voice breaking. "I've moved on. We've moved on." Damon placed a hand on Monique's shoulder, his touch grounding her. "You heard her," he said, his voice firm. "It's time for you to leave." Zach's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, it looked like he might argue. But then he took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "He's my son, too, and I'm not going to just walk away." Monique watched as Zach turned and walked out of the pizzeria, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. She let out a shaky breath, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. Damon pulled her into a hug, his arms warm and steady around her. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice soothing. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Monique buried her face in his chest, letting the tears fall. She had spent so long trying to be strong, to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. But in that moment, she allowed herself to lean on someone else, to let Damon share the burden. She knew that Zach's return was far of an end of the story. But for now, she allowed herself to feel safe, to feel loved. As the days passed, Monique tried to push the encounter with Zach to the back of her mind. She focused on her work, on Damon, and on the life they were building together. But Zach's words lingered, a shadow over her newfound happiness. She knew that he wasn't going to give up easily, and the thought filled her with dread. She had fought so hard to create a life for herself and her child, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. One evening, as she and Damon sat on the fire escape outside their apartment, watching the city lights flicker to life, Monique finally opened up about her fears. "What if he comes back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he tries to take my son?" Damon took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "He won't," he said, his voice steady. "We won't let him. You're not alone in this, Monique. I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and your son." Monique looked into Damon's eyes, seeing sincerity and determination there. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. She had spent so much of her life fighting battles on her own, but now she had someone in her corner. Together, they would face whatever came their way. And as she leaned her head on Damon's shoulder, watching the city stretch out before them, Monique allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. Zach didn't take no for an answer. A few days later, he returned to the pizzeria with a group of friends, intent on teaching Damon a lesson. The confrontation turned violent, and Damon was badly beaten. Monique watched in horror as the man she loved was left unconscious on the floor. She called the police, and Zach was arrested. But the damage had been done. Damon was rushed to the hospital, his injuries severe. Monique felt a mix of anger and guilt, but she refused to let Zach win. She would fight for her family, no matter what. As she sat by Damon's bedside, holding his hand, she vowed to never let anyone come between them again. She had found love, and she would protect it with everything she had. The months that followed Damon's recovery were a whirlwind of emotions. Monique stayed by his side, her unwavering support a testament to love they had built together. Damon's injuries had left him physically scarred, but his spirit remained unbroken. He often joked that the scars were just reminders of how far they had come, and Monique would smile, though her heart ached at the memory of that night. They had both been through so much, but they had come out stronger on the other side. As Damon regained his strength, they began to plan their future. The idea of leaving New York had been brewing in Monique's mind for a while. The city, with all its noise and chaos, no longer felt like home. It was a place of struggle, of pain, and she was ready to leave it behind. When Damon suggested moving to Colombia, Monique felt a spark of excitement. It was a chance to start over, to build a life far away from the shadows of their past. The decision wasn't easy. Monique had spent her entire life in the United States, and the thought of moving to a new country was daunting. But Damon's enthusiasm was infectious, and the more they talked about it, the more it felt like the right choice. They spent hours researching Barranquilla, learning about its culture, its people, and its opportunities. The idea of teaching English appealed to both of them. It was a way to give back, to make a difference in the lives of others. And so, after months of preparation, they packed their bags and boarded a plane to Colombia. The first few weeks in Barranquilla were a blur of new experiences. The heat was intense, the language barrier challenging, but the warmth of the people made up for it. Monique and Damon found a small apartment near the school where they would be teaching, and they quickly settled into their new routine. The work was fulfilling, and they both found joy in connecting with their students. For the first time in her life, Monique felt a sense of belonging. She had a purpose, a community, and a family. 3 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Monique and Damon had built a life together, one filled with love, laughter, and hope. They welcomed a daughter, Amelia, into their family, and she became the light of their lives. Monique often marveled at how far they had come. She had started her journey as a scared, lonely girl, and now she was a mother, a partner, and a teacher. She had found the love and stability she had always longed for, and she was determined to give her children a life she had never had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Monique sat on the balcony of their apartment, Amelia asleep in her arms. Damon joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the city come alive with the sounds of music and laughter. Monique leaned her head against his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked, her voice soft. Damon smiled, his eyes reflecting the golden hues of a sunset. "Every day," he said, "but I try not to dwell on the past too much. We've got too much to look forward to." Monique nodded, her gaze drifting to Amelia's peaceful face. "I used to think I'd never have this," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "A family, a home, love. I spent so much of my life feeling like I didn't deserve it." Damon turned to her, his expression serious. "You deserve every bit of it, Monique," he said, his voice firm. "You've fought for this life, and you've earned it, and I'm so proud to be a part of it." Tears welled in Monique's eyes as she looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. You saved me, Damon, in more ways than you'll ever know. Damon leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. We saved each other, he said softly. And now we got this beautiful life and this beautiful little girl, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Monique smiled through her tears, her heart full. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now she had everything she had ever dreamed of. As she held Amelia close, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The past was behind her, and the future was bright. She had found her home, her family, and her happiness. And as she sat there, surrounded by the people she loved, Monique knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.
Thank you for watching Gaby's cheating stories. Please subscribe. It just take 1 second. Thank you.